Actually remembered to hit record right at the beginning this time. Look at that. Um, okay. So tonight we're on the Module 7 readings, Chapter 13 and 14 in Ark and Beyond, Chapter 7 in Wilder Kingdom, and Chapter 11 in Zoos in 21st Century. Cleo, do you have something to say?
Okay. Yeah, Bjorn said he's locked out of his email and it won't let him change his password, so he'll be here soon.
Oh, send him. Can you just copy and paste the Zoom link to him?
Yeah.
Then he doesn't have to worry about that. Okay, no problem at all. I was gonna say, pretty odd for him to just not show up. That would be weird. Okay, so let's jump right in. There's actually like a lot of different stuff in these sections. It's interesting and good stuff to talk about. So Ark and Beyond, chapter 13 and 14 is about the Phoenix Zoo, and uh, I don't even remember what chapter 14 is about right now. How should zoo? Oh, making value-driven decisions about collections is what it's about. Okay. Um, so question one was about Operation Oryx. So what was Operation Oryx? Why was it unusual? And what's the story of the conservation effort and what can we learn from it? There's a lot to that question. But just in general, what did you take from that? Jasmine Anderson is ready. All right.
For this one, I put that Operation Oryx was a collaborative project developed to save the species from extinction. Though the efforts of several essential partner organizations, the last remaining, or through the efforts of several essential partner organizations, the last remaining Aravan oryx in the wild were brought to the Phoenix Zoo. The vision was unusual for a nascent zoo during that era. Nine animals were brought to the Phoenix Zoo to establish the world herd. After building up the population in captivity, descendants of the groups were released back into the wild in Oman in 1982. They were the first mammal to have its listing improved from critically endangered to vulnerable after they were considered extinct from the wild. And I also put we can learn from this collaborative collaboration. We can learn from this that collaboration with other facilities is in working to save an animal from extinction is essential.
Very good. Um, what did you guys? Yes, Annabeth.
You can go ahead,
No,
but I was
go
going to
ahead.
say it also acts as a good, what did I say exactly? A good model for future conservation efforts, especially reintroduction.
Hmm. Yeah. So what was unique about the Oryx situation, Ryan?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I don't know if this goes with your what you just asked,
That's okay.
but I thought it was really interesting. They I think were committed to the project before they even opened their gates for the zoo. So they were already committed to participating in the Conservation Act before, oh my God, my cat is yelling.
That's okay.
Um um but yeah, before the zoo even opened and then continued it as the zoo opened is what I took from the reading.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Um, it's kind of I guess a cool story. It's a nice story. We we read. I feel like often we try to emphasize the problematic aspects of zoos in this class because there are problematic aspects, and it's important that zoo folks know about those things. Um, but in many ways, this is kind of like a feel-good story. A zoo is establishing itself and starts out with a strong focus in conservation, and that's exactly how it should be, right? Um, it shouldn't be the other way around. And then, and it's a very successful effort. Um, what was weird about the situation with the oryx, though? So there was
Wait,
something
do you
about
mean
them in the
the
wild.
oryx itself or the
Yes.
zoo being new? Okay, it's not. Okay.
What was their status in the wild? Taylor.
I believe they were considered extinct in the wild. And through this program, they were able to is it called delisting? They're able to delist the
Hmm.
species, which is pretty special.
Yeah. Yeah. What is the goal of a conservation action? This is a pretty fundamental question. We're in a conservation-based class. We should probably know what the goal is, right? Yes, Tiffany.
To no longer need to conserve them, to delist them,
It's
hopefully.
Yeah, to delist them. That's it, right? To take them off that list, to get their population to a point that they don't have to be on that list anymore. That's the entire goal. It's a weird way to think about conservation. What's my goal? To remove them from this list of things that I have to worry about. That's really what it is. Um, they were extinct in the wild. That's kind of a big deal. Um, they were only really, had a functional population in captivity and not a very big one. And this is a success story um, where we were able to go from essentially extinct to a functional population again. That's pretty amazing. Unfortunately, it's rare for this kind of thing to happen, but it is a lesson worth taking from this that it can happen in the right circumstances. Yeah, Bjorn.
So, going off of what you just said, actually, something that I found really interesting about this story was the author was basically like using these conservation success stories to say that, it gives the public basically like a false perception of what zoos are actually capable of. And I feel like this particular story kind of also shows why it's not always possible for zoos to do these conservation reintroduction successfully. And what I mean by that is that this seems like it was a perfect story of right place, right time. Like you had this large, hoofstock mammal that lives in an arid environment that needs conservation, and there just so happened to be a zoo that was just opening in the desert looking to kind of build their collection. And so it seemed like in this case, like all the puzzle pieces kind of fell into place and all like the stars aligned, so to speak. And so it's, when you have a facility like that, has a lot of space, it has a lot of openings, that's not completely filled up, establishing these kind of conservation breeding programs are a lot easier. So I feel like this story kind of in general really exemplifies why these, captive breeding reintroductions, they're not always successful.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. If we compare the circumstances surrounding this particular situation to the many, many uh, less than adequate efforts, uh, we can see that there was this, like you said, like the stars aligning, these very perfect circumstances that allowed for this to happen. And I think that's a very measured way of looking at the situation. Um, but it does highlight that this can happen through these efforts. Um, and you're right, though, that it can also be deceptive because zoos lean into their successes, which we all should do that, but they really try to just sort of not talk about the failures, and it can lead to a situation that's less than honest with to the public in terms of what the capabilities of a zoo really are. Yeah. Anyone else take anything else from that question or that story as they were reading it? It's a pretty interesting story. Um, I just need to delete question two. Uh, it's kind of pointless. Question three. All right. From 1995 to 2014, the Phoenix Zoo released 20,000 Chiricahua leopard frogs. Have these releases been successful, and how do we know? Leo. Leo, you have to unmute yourself, dude.
Good. I wrote that some of the releases were considered to be successful because they took clippings of their toes, so whenever they were recapturing little individuals later, they were able to see that they were still alive in the wild.
Yeah, what do we call that when we do, this is at least very, very similar kind of idea. When we uh, use a mark on something to determine an estimate of population. Jasmine.
Well, I thought it was going to be mark recapture, but then you said, oh, it is. Okay.
It
Yeah.
is mark, 100%. Yeah. So we call those mark recapture techniques. They're really important in conservation studies. You mark something, you let it go, and then you see what proportion of those marked individuals you get back from the population later. You never get 100%, even if they're all survived, you wouldn't get 100%, right? Because when you're out in the field, you're not going to encounter 100% of the individuals you release. Um, but it's an important technique. Yeah, right.
I was just adding to the actual question for have these releases been successful? I wrote that they have been partially successful because even though you're able to observe the toe clipped individuals, you're not for certain that they've like successfully reproduced in the population. So I think you have to do a little bit more than just identifying. I think you would have to bring in, I don't know how they actually do this, but I would think just genetics, genetic testing of random samples to see if they're related to the zoo frogs.
Yeah, what a fantastic point to bring up. Yeah, if we release individuals into the wild, in support of a population, but they're not contributing to the reproductive success of the population. In other words, if so in population biology, we have just a handful of things that we worry about. The two of the biggest ones are birth rate and death rate. The others are immigration and emigration rate. Birth rate and death rate, though, are a really big deal. If we put these out in the population and they don't impact birth rate, then they don't end up really doing anything. They don't represent functional individuals within the population, um, at least in terms of conservation and in the stability of that population, right? So, really good point. Um, yeah, Caitlin.
Okay, so I actually had like a random thought point tying back to question two. You had said that like you're probably going to eliminate that question. It's not a great question, but
Okay.
an offshoot of that question, there was a part about the staff conservation grants program at the Phoenix Zoo where they talked about staff being able to make proposals to get
Mm,
involved with conservation projects in the field. And I actually thought that that was like a really cool and relevant program in terms of like staff engagement, like the Disney, when we did the Disney chapter, they talked about engaging staff, like makes them more committed to the mission and like broadening staff horizons to like be involved in conservation and like see kind of how the conservation mission is playing out. So I just thought that was like a really interesting tidbit that like related to conservation and like developing zookeepers and zoo staff. So like if you were to eliminate that question, I would suggest tying it into the staff grants part instead.
yeah, just rewrite the question. I think that's excellent feedback, Caitlin, and that is what I will do. I will restructure the question a little bit because you're right, that is important, and I didn't consider that. Thank you. Tiffany.
Kind of along with the grants, I looked it up quick. An interesting thing is they are no longer taking applications. It's only by invitation that you can actually get the grant. So they're being very, very choosy about what projects they're actually allowing these grants to go into, which might seem a little critical, but I think that's also they're very, very focused on what conservation efforts they actually want to put their money and research towards. But it says right in big font right there when it explains what it is that it's only by invitation now.
That's interesting. I have some problems with that particular situation because if it's by invitation, that means that they have to know you. They have to know, right, what efforts you're wanting to make in conservation to make a consideration. Um, but I guess on the flip side, if you know it exists and you have a project you want to do, you reach out and you make the effort to build the bridge, and then hopefully you get invited to apply, right? Um, that's interesting. I'm glad you looked that up. I'm sorry, you cannot apply. Cool. All right. Um, what do we think about the mark recapture thing with the frogs, with the Chiricahua leopard frogs? Do what do you guys think about how they mark the frogs? Annabeth, I felt like if anyone was going to have an opinion, it would be okay.
I wanted to be quick. I was like, I'm gonna have to raise my actual hand because it's gonna take too long to press the button. I think that that's probably the only way to do it. In my opinion, it's because it's not like a turtle where you can notch the shell. It's not like a bird where you can band it. Maybe there's some sort of band that you could do that wouldn't restrict the growth of like the legs. But in all honesty, that's probably the best way to do it. I read a paper about this is a little bit different because it's about telemetry and not like mark recapture, which I guess radio telemetry could be a form of mark recapture, but it was on or ornate horned frogs. And they gave them like a little zip tie, little fanny pouch, kind of. So that might be a good way of doing it, but that's also expensive. That's a piece of hardware that costs money. Um, so yeah, the toe thing is unfortunate and would cause suffering, which is not ideal welfare. But I can't think of a better way to do it. But I would like to hear what other people think because that's just my mind, and I'm open to hearing other people's opinions on that.
Okay, well, Jasmine Anderson had her hand up. Jasmine, what do you think?
I was gonna say, I feel like it's not something that I'm really against because it kind of reminds me of feral cats will or catch them and spay and neuter them and then clip their ear and release them back into the wild so that people know that this cat has been spayed or neutered and that it's easily identified. So I don't really have too much of an issue with the toe clipping.
Okay, Jasmine Kyle.
So, I agree with Annabeth in that there's not probably very many ways to do it with amphibians. However, I have done marker capture surveys with cheat mountain salamanders, and we injected a fluorescent dye into them. But I don't know if that dye lasts very long, so I don't think that would be as effective as a toe clipping. Um, as for the welfare, I feel like that is a temporary hurt that would heal and wouldn't really impact their life quality. Um, and later on in the chapter, it talks about natural behavior, like the definition of welfare for zoos. So I think that in a welfare sense, it also is fine.
Okay, Tiffany.
I can't remember if it was specifically the Amphibian Foundation or one of the lectures I had from them. They've actually, I think it's maybe they've only done it with axolotls, some kind of salamander. They tattoo the animal. So it's deep enough in the skin that it stays. They don't slough it off within an extended period of time. It might be harder in a more patterned animal, or to find a good spot on a frog. Salamanders have a little bit more landscape to put a tattoo in some cases, but they have done tattooing. And for the toe tipping, I worked in a specifically neurology mouse lab, so I'm used to tail tipping and punching ears. The toe tipping could also possibly go into the genetic study, where then you're also, if you keep the toe tipping, you then have genetic material to then compare it. You can do genotyping and then feasibly go and see if breeding is working. So it could also further go into the research. But it'd be interesting to see if anyone's tried tattoo. I don't know if they've tried the tattooing on frogs. I think it's primarily salamanders.
I will. I will tattoo a frog.
Oh gosh. Yeah, that's a great point. So there's different ways to mark animals. So the toe clipping is like a really it's old school field herpetology is what it is. It's like with snakes they would clip scales, for example. It's very old school methodology. Like if I have a book from like the 60s that talks about herpetological survey methods, and that's the kind of stuff they talk about in there because they didn't have technology. Certainly, they didn't have snake tattoos or anything like that. Um, Now, I'm not sure for frogs, but I think something like a subdermal pit tag would be a way to do this. That you would just, and then when you went out and caught your frogs, you would scan them with a pit tag scanner. And right, a pit tag is just like a little tiny chip um, that, at least in some animals, you can just put it right under their skin. And it's sort of like when you mark one of your pets so that if it gets lost, they know who it belongs to. They can scan, they just run a scanner over it, and it says, this is Dr. McKinney's pet. Um, but it has a unique number that identifies the animal, right? So I would think a pit tag type situation would work, but I don't know for sure. So, Tiffany, you raised your hand.
I think on that same, I took the master herpetology course through the Amphibian Foundation. I think through that same lecture, they were finding that the pit tags were too much trouble.
Mm,
That there was migration, some of them were coming out, I think due to how amphibian skin tends to work, that they found that really the tattooing and toe tipping and things like that was more worth their effort than trying to do pit tags.
okay, interesting. Uh, Jordan, you had your hand raised. You wanna? Are you just gonna say exactly the same thing?
No, no, I don't know how important this is, but something that I thought was kind of funny about that situation was they didn't identify exactly how many frogs were, from the breeding project. And granted, this isn't like the actual study, so they might have just thrown that in there like several frogs. But it just made me think that it's like, these frogs probably lose toes in the wild all the time. So I could just imagine that, some of the frogs they were looking at and they're probably like, he's missing a few more toes, but like you think, and granted, I don't really also know like the patterns that they use, exactly how they do it to identify it, but I feel like it's a method that might leave some questionable frogs in the area.
That's true. I mean, if a frog loses a toe naturally, and you pick it up and you think, "Oh, this is a study frog," that's a bit of a problem. So you might get some false positives. Annabeth.
Looked up if they've ever tattooed a frog for like capture and release purposes, and they have done it on African clawed frogs before.
Well, there you
But
go.
they're
So
also not a very patterned frog species. Not like a leopard frog would be, but
yeah, yeah.
it's something. It's definitely something. But I
So
I will I will do it one day. We will see.
yeah, okay. Um, yeah. So I guess the point just is that there are other methods out there. I don't know the pit tag migration issue. I could see being a problem. So I've pit tagged American eels before. That works really, really well. Um, but yeah, their skin's quite different. They're both slimy, but their skin's quite different. Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to look it up. Just a good thing to think about. Most, I think last time I taught this course and we talked about this question, some people were upset, like, oh my God, you cut the tips of the toes off the frogs. That's messed up. And it kind of is, right? Like, I mean, like, it is technically a form of mutilation, which we tend to frown upon, but it's we've been doing it for a long time in these ecological studies, and it doesn't really have a big impact on the frogs' well-being beyond the initial clipping, which I'm sure isn't very fun. Okay. Question 4. How was the narrow-headed garter snake a vote of confidence from conservation agencies in favor of the abilities of Phoenix Zoo? Are there other examples of this, and is it important or impressive to you that this all went down? I added that other stuff. Um, Tiffany.
So in this case, the Garter Snake Conservation Working Group themselves reached out to Phoenix Zoo. And they really wanted them for the purpose of researching life history, reproductive biology, behavior, feeding requirements. So they were putting a lot of faith in the Phoenix Zoo husbandry and scientific studies to actually know how to propagate these animals for reintroduction. Um, I'm not entirely sure of any other species that other facilities have done for this. I'm sure there's some. I just don't know any off the top of my head.
Gotcha. Yeah. Um, yeah, I just threw those on as I was looking over my notes and I was like, I wonder if anyone in this group knows of another situation similar to this. Yeah, Caitlin.
I don't know of another example, but I really liked the way this all happened because I like the idea of a like field research group reaching out to a zoo with just a few animals and like asking them to find out everything they can and potentially breed them because I feel like this is what zoos are good at and are often really well set up for in comparison to like other conservation groups. They might not have the resources, the setup, or the history with this sort of work. And I thought that this was like a really great example of a collaboration between two very different entities. And I feel like this is kind of like where zoos can be really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, it's it's a good look when a conservation group reaches out to a zoo, right? That looks really good on the zoo's part, that the conservation group recognizes the zoo's capabilities. Um, and I think that's the sort of thing that a zoo can brag about and feel proud of to be like, we have done such a good job at these things that these conservation groups that normally conservation groups have a sort of uh, I don't want to say weird's not the right word, hesitant perspective when it comes to zoos. So when one actually reaches out to a zoo, it's a big deal. And I think it happens probably more now than it did in the past, as zoos have become better and better over time at engaging in conservation. But I was hoping someone else would have an example just from like your experience being at a zoo, but that's okay. I think that this is an impressive thing, honestly. Like, if I was Phoenix Zoo, these are the kind. This is the. I would be bragging about this, I guess, which they kind of are in this chapter. So, yeah, Bjorn.
I do have somewhat of an example actually from the Kentucky Reptile Zoo.
Yeah.
And that's with the St. Lucian lancehead vipers. Um, as of right now, that's a at-risk species, and Kentucky Reptile Zoo right now has the only legal population outside of St. Lucia. And that was just because the owner, he went there and did some field work with them. And so he has special permission from that government to actually keep them. And I know other facilities were trying to get approved to do the same thing, because we were also breeding them, and at one point we bred a bunch of females, and all of them took and had successful clutches, which is very, very unusual. But we ended up with a ton of little baby vipers that we were raising, and we wanted to kind of distribute them to different facilities, but that was something that was really kind of only entrusted to Kentucky Reptile Zoo at that time.
So with those particular vipers, you had this big juvenile population. Were they intended to be partially re-released or anything like that, like released into the wild?
We were not set up for release, so that was basically just an assurance colony for the wild
Mm.
population. Just because it is, it's St. Lucia, it's an island, so um, like we talked about in previous classes, if a tsunami came or, a natural disaster or something, it would really kind of put them at risk. So we were not set up for release, but it was basically the colony to ensure they don't go extinct.
Well, clearly you guys either had tremendous just dumb luck or did something very right, right? Because you had very high reproductive success. So that's pretty cool. Um, did did the zoo share with um, I guess the conservation agency or that country? I don't. I guess I don't know exactly who the other entity is in play, but did they share that? Hey, we've had this great success. This is what we did. So this is how. You know what I mean? Did they share that information?
I'm sure they did. I don't really know. I was not the ones in contact with them, but Chris and Jim, the owners, they're, I mean, always talking to everybody. So I'm sure they had that kind of contact because they're still in contact with those people.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, that's such a big thing. If a zoo can do that, uh, they can come up with a protocol that's highly effective for reproduction, and then if they can share that, that's like a really, for one, it shows great character of the zoo to be willing, to share. Um, but it's also like a really good thing from a conservation perspective, right? Like that's a big deal. So that's cool. That's a good example. Was this the government itself of the island, or was it a conservation agency that was kind of overseeing this population of vipers?
I believe it was both. I'm not
Hmm.
100% sure, but they were working with biologists there in St. Lucia. But I think to actually import them and keep them in the US, they needed permission from the government itself.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Maybe their equivalent of like a DNR or something. Um, Interesting. Very, very cool. All right.
I'm getting word that it was actually the Department of Forestry in St. Lucia.
So probably really similar to the
Yeah.
DNR. Yeah. Uh-huh. Cool. So is Mariah spying on us right now? Is that what's happening?
Sort of, yeah. She's
Yeah,
listening in.
that's great. She's gonna have to do this next year. I don't know what. She'll already know all the answers. That's the trick. Um, let's go to question 5. So, how does Phoenix Zoo integrate conservation education into its operations? Abby is ready for this one. Hand up immediately.
Am I unmuted? Okay. I have the zoo weaves conservation education into its many family educational programs and school field trip programs, and it is committed to fostering the creation of a new generation of conservation stewards through university internships and research fellowships. And then I also have this commitment is also woven into the everyday guest experiences via the zoo's safari train and extensive on grounds signage. And the new exhibits at the zoo incorporate strong conservation messages emphasizing what guests can do in their daily lives to make a difference for wildlife and their habitats.
Okay, yeah. I think there are probably a few other things that we could add on there. Does anybody have anything else they want to add to that? Tiffany?
They're the co-hosts of Project Dragonfly, which is another kind of master's program geared towards educators for conservation and stuff like that. And then they actually changed the theme of their annual fundraising gala to be specifically about wildlife conservation in order to raise funds for that. And personally, I've been to the Phoenix Zoo and specifically they hosted AZAC last year, specifically took their program for animal ambassadors and things like that. And so I've seen they have a team that's literally just for ambassador animals and education on site in programming, and then a specific team that does like field trips, camps, things like that. So it means a whole lot to them that they have two separate, very large teams just for educating the public, and they put a whole lot of effort into their specific programming. Um, and including local conservation as well. Some of their signage, it's not like in your face that it has a conservation message, but it's definitely there. Funnily enough, I don't think they bragged about the Arabian oryx enough. I got to see them. They're really fantastic. It does look like you're just there with Arabian oryx in the desert where they're naturally supposed to be. The joy of being in Phoenix.
Yeah.
And they have like a statue and stuff, but I don't think they brag about it enough.
Interesting. Um, yeah, I didn't know that they had the really large education uh, staff that you're talking about, and that's great. And that's a lot of money, right? One of the big costs to run any business is paying people to do the work. So
But it also gains them money because they're doing paid programming. So worth it in their eyes.
sure, yeah. Well, I yeah, I would say any business they don't pay staff that don't somehow generate money, right? But yeah, I get what you're saying. They're a source of revenue for the zoo. Yeah, that's awesome. Um, I think it's important to think about, not just with Phoenix Zoo, but with zoos in general, how they approach doing this, how they integrate um, conservation education into the different things they do, because one of the big conservation aspects of zoos is in the educational realm, and all of you are going to, well, I guess I don't know. Actually, some of you might never go to a zoo again in your life, but if you're intending to work at zoos, um, knowing about this and having different ideas about this, I think is pretty valuable. You might have an idea that no one else at your zoo thought about just because you spent the time to sit and think about this stuff. Um, Question 6. What was the point of their rebranding in 2014? And does this seem familiar to any other examples we've read about? Yes, Caitlin.
The point of the name change was to show their commitment to conservation and try to get the Metro Phoenix community to like see them as a conservation organization because that is not really how they were viewed. And this was similar to one of the examples. It was earlier in the reading. I think it was in New York. Maybe it was Bronx. I can't
Mm-hmm.
remember. It was in New York too. But their rebranding was not very successful, but it was kind of the same thought process.
Yeah, the Bronx Zoo, much earlier in the reading, like chapter 2 or something, they talked about that. Yeah, Bjorn.
So I just wanted to add on to that I thought was interesting that, the difference was that the Phoenix Zoo didn't try to rebrand like their common name, which was the strategy that the Bronx Zoo did. They rebranded like the parent organization or the organization that oversees the zoo itself. So they didn't really have people actually referring to probably this organization very often. And so
Yeah.
that's why at least I think the Bronx Zoo was unsuccessful in trying to make it the International Wildlife Conservation Park. And the Phoenix was much more successful in that sense.
Yeah, that's a good comparison between the two, and that might be exactly why. It could be other things too, but I think that's a pretty good perspective to take on that. It could literally be time, um, you know, 2014 versus, gosh, when did the Bronx Zoo do that? That was, several decades prior. Um, but yeah, it's pretty interesting. And the, what do you think about this? Like, should other zoos do this? Should your zoo tomorrow, if you work at a zoo right now, go and rename themselves and slap conservation on there somewhere? Yeah, Annabeth.
I think it depends if the zoo is already conservation oriented. Well, ideally, all accredited zoos should have at least some conservation orientation. But I do know a lot of people don't like things whenever the names are changed. Like if we have something and we call it by the name for like ever, and then something changes, a lot of people get upset unless it's a really good reason.
Yeah.
So I think it just depends on one, like visitor feedback, and two, orientation of like what the zoo wants to outwardly show. So maybe a good way of doing that would be like a survey with their like members or people who constantly go to the zoo to see if a hypothetical name change would be valid and would have a good response from the community because you
Yeah.
don't want to lose a bunch of people. You don't want to lose faithful zoo guests over something like a name change.
Yeah. Ryan, you had your hand up. You bailed, but
Yeah, I don't really know if I'm gonna say this. My words are gonna get all jumbled, but I don't know. I kind of don't understand the whole renaming thing because I don't know, you changing your name, are you changing your organization? Like I get that they want to show the public and like kind of be more outward of like this is what we do and like we're here for conservation. But kind of going with what Annabelle said, like people like the name zoo, and that's people are stuck on that. So shouldn't we focus on making zoos better? So when people think of a zoo, they think of conservation rather than change the name and be like, oh, zoos are bad. And I think this is something I thought of at the Bronx Zoo too. Like, is it not kind of a dig that you don't want to be called a zoo anymore? It feels kind of like you're going in circles because you want to improve zoos, but by changing the name, well, dang, in 100 years from now, we're going to be improving that too. So a name change doesn't, to me, make a whole big of a difference. I feel like action and what the zoo's doing and what the organization is participating in, the conservation they're doing, matters a lot more than the name. I hope that made somewhat
It
of
makes
sense.
a ton of sense to me. I really like that. Yeah. Caitlin.
Kind of hate rebranding only because it usually costs a lot of money to rebrand. And I feel like that's money that could be better used in conservation efforts. We just went through a rebranding at the Detroit Zoo. We didn't change our name, but we changed our logo, and that had to be changed on everything. We have this massive water tower that we repainted that cost a lot of money. We got all new uniforms that cost a lot of money. We did all new signage with the new logo on everything. The zoo didn't disclose how much it cost, but I'm sure it cost millions of dollars. And like, that's maybe not millions, maybe that's excessive, but like probably a million, like all new uniforms for all the staff, all of the paperwork documentation, like that got changed. Like that logo is everywhere now, and we got rid of everything with the old logo. And I just feel like that money could have been better utilized on other conservation missions. So when anybody rebrands, like money goes into that. And is that where you want to spend your money?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I have a lot to say about that. But Jasmine Anderson, go ahead.
I was gonna say the facility I work at, we're kind of going through a sort of rebranding. My great aunt and uncle, they owned it and have been the private owners for about 30 years, and we are ZA accredited, but we're gonna be shifting to a nonprofit model. So we're having to do a bunch of rebranding. But I think for some places like that, it's a bit essential. We have conservation efforts that we're doing, and we're just gonna be reestablishing them with our nonprofit status.
It's very cool. Um, First, well, I want to say what Ryan said. Instead of rebranding and going away from the name zoo, making zoos, representing zoos in a light that makes people just cool with the word zoo, I think is a very, very good approach. Even though it takes a lot of time to change the cultural paradigm about things, right? It's no matter how much good work a zoo does, it won't change instantly. Like it takes that those ideas and perspectives have to percolate through society, and it takes generations for those ways of thinking to turn over. But I think that's a lot better idea than abandoning the word zoo. As for rebranding, rebranding makes me very frustrated. It is, in my opinion, extremely rarely necessary. I think about the recent rebranding of Cracker Barrel. Um, are you all familiar with? I mean, if you, it's a Cracker Barrel is a restaurant, okay? Google Cracker Barrel on your phone. Um, it's a restaurant, and they they do home style food. Um, and they have a sort of old-timey feel to them. That's their brand. And they didn't get rid of that. They literally just like changed their logo and people made a huge deal about it. It was really stupid. They didn't even change the color or anything. They just changed the shape of the logo. And that's pretty well all they did. And there was no reason to do it. I just thought, like, if you think about people going to this restaurant, not a single one of them was like, well, I'm not going to eat there anymore. They changed their logo. People were irritated about it because it was dumb. And at the same time, no one saw that logo change and went, oh man, that logo makes me want to eat at Cracker Barrel, right? Like it didn't change anyone's perspective. The only thing I can think is it was a silly way to advertise, essentially. Like, we're going to change our logo. People will see that we changed our logo and it's a form of advertisement. Uh, And maybe that is exactly what the strategy is, but it's ultimately, I think, typically pointless. Uh, Another example that's not a zoo example of rebranding is I taught at a school called Alderson Broaddus, and um, they were financially struggling, and one of their strategies was in not entirely rebranding, I wouldn't say, but they updated their logo. They, I mean, they really did a sort of rebranding. They changed the motto of the school. They um they slightly changed the colors and they made these very like these are the official colors. This is, that kind of thing. It's all part of branding. Let me tell you how that did not do a single thing to change enrollment in AB, and I truly mean nothing. As a matter of fact, enrollment continued to drop and AB is not open today. That's how bad that went. Yeah, rebranding. And they spent a lot of money to do that, right? No one's doing that work for free. Uh, we could have used that money for our students, maybe to create better facilities that would have attracted more students. But the people in charge tend to make questionable decisions. I'll just say that. Caitlin.
Okay, I looked it up. The Detroit Zoo spent 267,000 on a comprehensive rebranding campaign, but it doesn't go into exactly what that entails. But then it spent 800,000 redoing our water tower. Like we have a water tower with the zoo's
Holy
logo
crap.
on it. Yeah, 800,000 for an installation of a 30-foot vinyl wrap of the iconic water tower is what it says. So I was way overboard with millions, but like we spent over $1 million.
I think $1 million. I can't believe that it cost $800,000 to vinyl wrap a water tower, but I don't do vinyl wrap, so what do I know? That's wild. I would have just left the old logo on the water tower. My God. It costs 4 times as much to wrap the tower as it did to do the rebranding. That's so stupid. Yeah, what a waste of money, right? That $800,000 could have went toward any number of much more important things than a different logo on a water tower. Um, and almost anything would have been better, honestly. So yeah. Okay. Well, so there you go. The next time one of your zoos talks about rebranding, tell them not to do it. It's a complete waste of their money. Let's see here. The problem is the people on the ground that think about these things are not the people that run the institution. The people that run the institution are crazy. Not all of them, but Cleo, yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to add in with like name changes and stuff. Sometimes it gets confusing for people that know that place as that specific name. Just
Mhm.
for example, there was a little gas station in my hometown, and it was always referred to as Hills of Home, and then Martin's bought it out. So then people would say like, "Oh, I'm going to Martin's," and I would drive to 30 minutes away instead of the gas station that was like 10 minutes away just because the new name was there's two places now that have the same, it just gets confusing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to probably beyond what I really want to go into here for various reasons, but there's a lot to a name, and when you change a name, um, we hold names in a certain context. Once we've learned them, like that name means that thing, and when you take that away and you change that, it's sometimes asking a lot of the people that have learned to speak in those terms to come rewire their brains, right? You have to rewire your brain to now use this completely different name. And yeah, especially old people. The older you get, the harder it is to rewire your brain. Trust me. Um, chapter 14. I'm gonna read chapter or what this question 7 is real quick. Okay. Yeah, we should talk about this. I do want to say I haven't got everyone's response yet. If you haven't responded, you should respond in the next 10 minutes. Chapter 14 aims to address zoo collection decisions given the aims and values of zoo associations. So the authors exclude zoo associations that are outside of WAZA, ISA, and ACA. Is this problematic in unraveling the complexities of this decision? Jasmine. You're not muted, but I cannot hear you, so I think you're having a mic malfunction. Yeah, I heard a click. There you
Yeah, I'm in now. Hacker voice. Okay.
go.
So it is very problematic. I did some research, and in the United States alone, less than 10% of USDA certified zoos are AZA accredited. Less than 10%. That's over 2,000 zoos that aren't being considered here. So that was in the United States alone, and I thought that was a strong enough figure to back up yeah, I think that's problematic. That leaves out a lot of people's viewpoints in a lot of situations.
Yeah, yeah. So it is probably, if you're really trying to think about these zoo collection decisions, it's probably important to think beyond. I'm sorry, Taylor, go ahead. I didn't see you raise your hand.
Oh, that's okay. You can finish what you're saying.
You go right ahead.
Okay. I was just kind of like a thought that I had was like kind of excluding associations outside of these three, kind of prominent accreditation organizations, that it kind of makes it seem like all of the zoos are on like a united front. I feel like these three organizations tend to like agree on a lot of things, and I don't think that they really included any opposing views or like any zoos that might not think the same way. And I feel like that kind of gives an illusion that like there's like this unification when I don't feel like there necessarily is.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, WASA, EAZA, and AZA don't represent the totality of zoodom. I know I made that word up, but uh they don't represent uh all zoos. And so yeah, it's a problematic way to analyze this, I think. Nonetheless, that's what we're working with in this chapter. So it's important when you're reading the chapter. I think it's very important to think the whole time, like, this is a narrow perspective, but it's at least something. So it's still valuable. Yeah, Ryan.
I think earlier in one of the earlier classes, it was maybe Caitlin maybe brought this up, that it's quite expensive to be a part of some of these organizations, especially AZA. So your smaller facilities, sanctuaries, zoos that can't financially be a part of this are minus like it's like USDA stuff, but do they have any conservation rules or like regulations? What are they like compared to an AZA zoo? What are they not doing? Do they just have freedom to do whatever the heck they want with their animals kind of all the time? Or do they have other regulations that they have to follow?
Yeah, Taylor, go ahead.
Oh, I have an unrelated question, so we can talk about what she was talking about first.
Okay, well, so let's go to that. So we know that there are all zoos have certain things that they have to follow, right? Like the Animal Welfare Act. There are laws in place that are universally applicable to zoos. Um, and yeah, just because you're not AZA doesn't mean that you don't do conservation. Uh, as But there are plenty of zoos that aren't AZA that don't do conservation. There are also AZA zoos that barely do conservation, right? As we talked about earlier, I think just a couple, maybe last week. Um, but yeah, I mean, um, there are legal requirements those are stipulations that are universal. They're not it's not the same as an accreditation uh, body. Because those aren't laws, right? The rules of the accreditation body are just simply that they're rules set forth by the body as a sort of expected standard to stay accredited. Um, they're not laws. So does that make sense? So Taylor, go ahead. What was your
Yeah, kind of had a question. So the question like specifically talks about zoo association. So not all zoos are necessarily under a zoo association, right? Or does by saying zoo association, do you just mean like all zoo and aquarium like facilities in general?
So not all, some zoos are just independent zoos, right? As a matter of fact, I think it's probably fair to say most zoos fall under that category. Um, so yeah, not all zoos, not all aquariums are specifically a part of an association.
I see. So zoos that aren't even within associations, even if the author had gone and included all the other, let's say, zoo associations, these zoos that aren't within these associations, like their opinions wouldn't have been included
That's
anyways.
correct. Yeah, that's correct. Tiffany?
Um, from personal experience, maybe one way I didn't think this was as narrow as it possibly was, as a non-AZA facility that I work at, we were once AZA, um, lost it, and we're working back to it. Um, we still follow the AZA guidelines. We just aren't accredited. And I know of quite a few facilities where actually going through accreditation, they cannot feasibly do it. A lot of it is actually financial reasons that they cannot financially become accredited. And they might be ZAA as like a stepping point and stuff like that, which is also voluntary, requires funding. Um, but I know a lot of very small facilities where they're like, actually being accredited isn't worth it to us, but we believe in these guidelines and we're going to follow these guidelines to the best of our abilities. So they're still kind of having the same aims and values as these facilities. They're just not under their umbrella. And I've seen that a lot in especially small facilities, very tiny ones that they're like, we just don't have the means, but we're still going to do what an AZA facility does.
Yeah, that's um well, I have a question to add or to bounce off of that, but I'm gonna let Jasmine Anderson speak first.
I was gonna say that it's kind of the same like my zoo. We were AZA and lost it because we didn't have a full-time vet on the property. Now we do, and we're ZAA accredited, but we still try to do the same. We still keep the AZA standards, but we probably aren't going to get AZA accredited anytime soon.
Yeah, so let me throw out a question I think is a really good thing to think about. How do you feel about the fact that you can be doing all the things that AZA wants you to do, uh, but there's this financial threshold that is keeping you from putting those three letters on all your stuff? How do you feel about that? Yeah, Tiffany.
So, as someone who came from AZA to non-AZA, um, a, AZA is some pretty fancy letters, and it's what you really want when you are doing this is the abilities that AZA gives you. Literally within the past week, we were reached out by basically the head of the mountain lion. He does mountain lions in Washington that had a juvenile mountain lion. Mom died due to rat poison. They caught her and they're like, she needs a home immediately. We know you need a mountain lion. So her name's Rain, for Mount Rainier. We
Uh,
have Rainy in quarantine. We could not send her to a good airport that would have been easier for us because it would have taken too long for us to get the permitting. But if we were AZA, we would have been exempt and it would have happened immediately. We wouldn't have had to talk to anyone. So it does suck that just because we don't have those letters on our name, that we don't get the same exemptions, even though we are working towards the same standards, because we don't have the political backing that we would have if we were AZA. And there are plenty of fantastic facilities. I know Honolulu lost their accreditation not that long ago. They might be reaccredited at this point because they weren't capable of having the backup funds to ensure that their zoo, if disaster hit, that they were capable of keeping it. I think it's 5 years. You're supposed to have the fundings that your zoo could safely and feasibly run for 5 years until you could regain funding or anything like that. So having that funding be the issue and not it necessarily just be you could be taking the best care of your animals, you could be golden standard, but just because you don't have enough money, it's silly in my opinion, as I've watched fantastic facilities lose accreditation because they didn't have the money.
Yeah. Yeah, I have something to go off of there too, but Annabeth has her hand raised, so
Mine's not really anything to add. I just want to say that I'm very glad that we're having this conversation because for the longest time, and I'm not from a zoo background. I just am here for grad school and I do the fellowship.
yeah.
But I think I've always had in my head that good zoos are accredited zoos. And now that I'm hearing everyone's like input on this, I can like feasibly say that's incorrect. There are good zoos that do good work that aren't accredited. And I just want to say that I'm glad that I'm hearing this out because it's made me realize I probably passed up on some really good zoos that I just haven't gone to because I was like, oh, they're not accredited. It's not worth my time. But now I'm glad that my eyes are open to that
Oh,
because
good.
I'm just happy because I feel better. I feel better now.
Good. Um, yeah, so yeah, I do think it's an important thing to talk about. So you're talking about having money for like basically a 5-year pool of cover our asses if everything goes sideways. Oh, Bjorn's got his hand up now. I'm sorry, Bjorn. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was also just going to add, and I think this is kind of going off of what Tiffany said, but just not being AZA accredited doesn't mean that you're not necessarily involved with AZA institutions. So like Kentucky Reptile Zoo, for example, like we have, they're king cobras that are like the grandchildren of one of our biggest snakes there at Columbus Zoo. Like we have distributed animals. So we still kind of maintain that relationship. I think one thing that's also very interesting in this discussion is something that my eyes were kind of open to when I went to the Orient Center for Indigo Conservation. Um, Down there, they are working through the Central Florida Zoo. So it is a conservation organization, but it is AZA accredited. One of the things that, we cannot do at Kentucky Reptile Zoo is provide enrichment for 1,300 snakes, a couple times a week, which, as far as my understanding goes, is a requirement for AZA institutions. Now, the venom extraction and stuff like that, that was enrichment enough. But when I went to the Orient Center for Indigo Conservation, they would actually do various things, and some of them were really cool. Like they would add, tubes into the enclosures or like boxes with like shredded paper. But then they would also do stuff like they would put like seasonings in little like triangular pieces of paper or like crunch up little pieces of paper and like mix them up with oregano so it was a scent thing. And pretty much everyone there was like, this is so dumb. But it's like we we have to do this based on the AZA regulations and the Central Florida Zoo guidelines basically. So yeah.
I don't know I don't think you have to do that every day. I don't know exactly.
No, it's up to the institution's discretion. The only things that they have where you have to have a certain amount of enrichment is non-human primates, but that's USDA as well.
Yeah.
And some birds, specifically like parrots and stuff. And then that's also somewhat USDA. As the person who has written an institutional enrichment plan, it is up to you have to have a plan. And you have to be recording it, but it's up to the institution's discretion of how often they think it should be necessary. And then institutions will kind of collaborate, being like, we found you needed this much. Um, so I know my last institution, we shot for twice a month.
Yeah,
So that
Ryan.
was also,
Oh,
let me clarify, that wasn't a daily thing. I don't know if I said daily, but I think they did that like once or twice a week for each individual snake. But that must have been something that the Central Florida Zoo itself regulated then, not
yeah,
AZA.
that's their standard, basically. Um, Interesting. Ryan.
Yeah, I was just I don't know how correct this is. At my facility in my building, we have Sierra. She does all of our reptile and amphibian exhibits. Um, and I feel like I remember her saying that AZ doesn't require an enrichment program for reptiles, amphibians. And I don't believe it requires it for all birds either, because our zoo recently started like including more enrichment programs. And I only know this because I see like the enrichment forms as people send them in for parrots and macaws and birds. I believe their old supervisor for birds didn't like enrichment for birds for some reason. But yeah, I don't think there is any sort of formal requirement for enrichment for reptiles and amphibians, which is something Sierra has been trying very, very, very hard to change. So
Mm. Don't want to get deep in the weeds with this. Um, Snakes, boy, I don't even know if I should go here. Uh, do snakes need significant enrichment, do you think? I don't know. I want Bjorn to answer this question. Bjorn, you're, of all the people in this space, the most snaky individual. You have worked with a lot of snakes. Do you think snakes need enrichment? Not reptiles in general, okay? Lizards is a whole different ball game. But snakes, do you think snakes need enrichment?
I think that's a very, very tough question, and
That's
I
why I
think
asked
that
you.
it also really, really depends on the species of snake, but it
Mhm.
also really depends on what you classify as enrichment.
Mhm.
So, like for us, like I mentioned, we did venom extractions, and so we ensured that snakes were not extracted from more than once every 2 weeks, like at the most, because it is a very, very stressful thing. Um, but enrichment, in my opinion, also when it comes to snakes, it's basically a substitution for stressors that they would encounter in the wild. And so our mentality is like we're putting them through this stressful thing. Like that's enrichment, right? So for the rest of the time, we want them to be left alone as they would be in the wild as much as possible so they can recoup from that. And same thing like here at West Liberty, we have a bunch of reptiles, but we also have a ton of students and a bunch of undergraduate students who are walking through the spaces all the time, who are checking on these snakes daily. And so for me personally, I think a great enrichment for that animal would just be leave it alone for a little bit. So I think the enrichment, yes, but I would be very, very careful to define what that actually means for snakes, and even go further to kind of further define what that means for the individual species and the behaviors of that species.
That's a good answer. Tiffany.
Uh, as someone who had to implement enrichment program for reptiles, including a bunch of snakes, including venom, uh, the including even the veterinary care for reptiles, especially snakes, it's basically husbandry. So when we were trying to come up with enrichment for snakes, it seemed like we were trying to substitute good husbandry. So if your husbandry is poor, then your snake's probably going to need enriched. So, for example, if your boa constrictor doesn't have anywhere to climb and to be in the trees, then it's going to need enriched. So that way it can, do what it's supposed to do. But we would give stuff to some snakes and they're like, what the heck is this? And they wouldn't care. There'd be no reaction whatsoever, could not care less because they were already fulfilled through their husbandry. So it was so hard, especially even for like frogs. Their enrichment is what they live in. So how do I change their husbandry already when they are so fully enriched? So I feel like in reptiles and snakes, enrichment is a substitute for husbandry.
That's a good perspective. Caitlin.
We just revamped like our enrichment across all departments, across all taxa. And when I was in the amphibian department, I helped shape how that was going to be restructured. And what we did, it's a lot of what Tiffany's saying, is we like did a deep dive of their natural history and looked at like what behaviors are most important to that frog's life per se. And a lot of them were like basic things like, okay, it's a frog that hunts, it's a frog that climbs. So you're giving it options to hunt, you're giving it options to climb. But we also looked at enrichment at a more like broad, almost annual perspective rather than like mammals. A lot of times you're looking at daily, weekly, but we would look at like, okay, we're going to put them through a dry season and then a wet season to encourage egg laying. So, like, that is their enrichment, but it's happening over the course of a year, not over the course of like a week. So, this enrichment event might be like 2 months long of a dry spell and then 2 months long of increased, water, and then giving them whatever they lay eggs on. Like, that whole thing is enrichment, but that is also husbandry.
Yeah, I love that because I think that, the consideration for the natural history of the animal is the most important thing. If you can more closely s- simulate the real conditions and the seasonality, which it sounds like you're considering, um, that's extremely valuable. Ryan.
Hi, I have another maybe dumb question, but the zoos that aren't part of these organizations like ACA, someone said like they have requirements for primate enrichment, stuff like that. Do those also through whatever like general regulations they have also have rules for enrichment? Are they required to provide
Yeah,
enrichment?
primates are
And is it just
really,
primates? What about hoofstock and other ungulates
I
and
don't know about hoofstock.
there's
Tiffany
also
might, maybe Tiffany knows. That's a good question.
I don't know specifically if they have regulations. Sometimes it's up to your inspector. So a lot of this is going to be USDA. Birds were just added 2 years ago under the USDA umbrella. Non-poultry, I should say, non-poultry birds were added under the umbrella, and it is required in their regulations that you have an environmental enrichment plan. If you don't, you can literally get dinged and have a major thing for that. But it's the same thing with AZA and other accreditations. It's kind of sometimes up to the discretion of your inspector. We also have close to us, like we have elk, that are part of the like certified elk herd for the states and everything. So I don't know if they specifically have regulations. I'll have to ask because I don't work with them specifically. But through USDA, there's some regulations, especially for non-human primates, but that's also because of research. Um, and then birds, you are required to have environmental. It has to be part of how you keep them. Um, and then I think there is very minimal regulations for like uh cattle, dairy cattle and stuff like that, which is mainly a well-being, not necessarily in the sense of enrichment, but some of it ends up being enrichment. But yeah, so if you are not following USDA regulations, you cannot have those animals, and that includes enrichment. Um, and so uh, sometimes that's really up to you what you consider enrichment and what's up to the inspector. And then your inspector might prefer things on top of that. So they could be like, well, I don't think you're doing this enough, so I'm going to ding you, I'm going to write you up. Um, Depends.
Yeah.
thank you, by the way. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that was yeah, I didn't know that. Uh, Primates are serious business. I wasn't so sure for hoofstock how they treated that. Um, so we're at 8:14. We are past our normal time to stop and take our break for the night. Let's take a 10-minute break. I'll see you back at 8:24. All right. Welcome back. Well, we still have quite a bit to talk about. Hmm. Might skip a couple questions here. Um, go to 18, but I think I'll try to keep this pretty concise. I think we discussed this. Almost positive we discussed this previously. So question 18. The author states in terms of conservation education, we don't know much about the specific effects of species composition in zoos. Um, we did talk about it because I literally wrote it in the question. Uh, so what can you take from this regarding the direction that zoos need to go in the future? Jasmine Anderson.
From this statement, I put that I think that researchers should try to mix up the species that are in zoos because it is unsure whether large or small animals have more of an impact on the people that visit zoos. They should try to incorporate more threatened or endangered species and share their conservation story because that could have as big as an impact as having larger, more charismatic species.
Okay. Um, yeah. Uh, Jasmine Kyle.
I put the same thing as her, but I also included the fact that it seems like um, I think I referenced because I read the books at whatever order I want to read them in. I referenced the Desert Museum, their survey in which people were more they were more attracted to zoos with their proximity to wildness. So I think that combined with people sort of the findings they had surrounding the fact that the broad idea that people are only attracted to charismatic mammalian megafauna, not exactly being accurate, and maximizing on space with having a wide variety of different species. Combine that with the proximity to wildness that the Desert Museum supplies, I think that that is a good direction for zoos to head in the future.
Okay. Anyone else have anything they wanted to add? I have a very different take on this question, but I think that might just be the way the question's worded. Um, Nothing that anyone said was wrong, of course. It just wasn't maybe what I was trying to get out of it. Caitlin.
I think we should try to actually research and study that, like study the difference between zoos that have more mixed zoos, like a lot of different types of taxa. There are zoos that are more focused on reptiles or on amphibians. I think we should try to take a focused look at that rather than saying, like, oh, we're really not sure, but, we need to move forward. I think we should try to get a handle on that to figure out what is drawing people in and how do we change perceptions, kind of. If it is mammals focused, how do we change focus to our other taxa?
Hmm. Yep. Tiffany?
Um, I had mentioned that if the species composition has no effect on education that we know of, we should be moving toward more towards focusing on how we present the information instead of prioritizing specific species to give that information on. So, in a lot of times, um, we use a proxy species because we think that's more gonna bring more people in because they want to see that, and then use that to talk about the threatened species. Well, if they're going to be just as attracted by that threatened species, then have that dedicate the space and the funding to that species and use them for the education in that sense instead of focusing just on proxy species.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so um that those are all everyone had really really good ideas there. So what I said I think leans mostly toward uh what Caitlin mentioned, and that is that we or zoos need to get good at assessing how effective their conservation or their, I'm sorry, their education in this case efforts are with these different species. Like we can't make decisions without first assessing where we're at, right? Like what is working with what we're doing, what's not working with what we're doing. And whether it's questions about species composition and its relation to zoo education or conservation education or anything else for that matter, we have to have some formal assessment where we can look at it. We have data, right? We make decisions driven on empirical evidence and not on our gut feelings because our gut feelings aren't always right. Um, and so zoos need to spend the time to figure out with through empirical data, like Caitlin was saying, if there's a most effective way, if that species composition does or doesn't matter. And there is some information like we'll read about a little bit later uh, in this module, but it's not. It could be done a lot better, right? Zoos do a poor job of assessing the impacts of the things they're doing and using that sort of empirical data to make decisions to make things better. So, um, yeah, but everyone had really, great points on that question. All right, I do want to move just because there's quite a bit to talk about, and it's 8:30. I'm going to move forward a little bit. Okay, Ryan, go ahead.
Sorry, I know we were probably crunched on time, but question 14 I thought was really interesting. It talks about culling in zoos. If there's time later, do you think that's something we could come back to? I'm interested to hear people's thoughts
We
on this. And
we could talk about it right now. I didn't mean to skip it. I don't know how
it's
many questions
okay.
how many
You've
questions did I
actually had
skip?
you've had a couple questions in the other forums about culling, and it's just become a relevant topic at my zoo. We have a colony of bats that's gotten a little out of hand, and all operations to cull or not cull have been halted because of the ethics of it. And there's a lot of back and forth. It's gotten really heated, and I just was curious if anyone else has had experience of culling in zoos, conservation, any of that. I didn't realize it was so prominent in zoos that culling is used as a management tool so often, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we can talk about that actually. So we'll talk about that. And then I also want to definitely talk about question 12. I didn't mean to skip this page. I think I just scrolled too fast when I was going through my Word document and overshot a whole page. And that was not the intent. I just was trying to skip a couple questions. So I'm glad that you brought that up. So let's go ahead and talk about question 14 now. And we'll get back um, later to these other things. So what is the painless culling of surplus animals, and is it a serious issue? Yes, Caitlin.
So usually painless culling refers to euthanizing animals that are healthy, but typically there is not space for them or they are not genetically useful to the population. So that's like typically the root cause of culling. It's more common with mammals, especially in Europe, than it is in the United States. In the United States, it's pretty frowned upon, and we tend to use birth control to manage populations, whereas the European mindset is more like there is inherent value in going through the act of reproducing and raising young. So they feel like they don't really want to deprive animals of that experience when it is a natural experience. So they will breed sometimes even when they know, like if they get a male, that they're not going to keep it and it's not going to be useful. So they will then cull it. It's less commonly practiced here, but like when I answered this question, I was like, oh, we don't really do that as much here. It is something that used to happen more in the United States. And I don't know if everyone considered this culling, but like when I was in an amphibian department, if we found eggs that we knew we didn't need, it was a species of frog that were not actively breeding, we would bleach them or freeze them before they were too developed, because we didn't want to have 20 plus more frogs or whatever. But like some might view that as a form of culling.
Okay, Tiffany, you want to build upon that?
Um, I would say culling in the States at least is still a valid population management tool, especially in herps, where not only can you have large clutches of animals at once, but also we're having an increased notice of parthenogenesis. So, for example, I worked with Komodo dragons, which we already have a small viable population in managed care. And so, because parthenogenesis is fairly common, not even just in captivity, but in the wild too, I think it was my ZM, zoological manager at the time, at the tag. They were talking about Komodo dragons. Um, I think it might have been just us. Our facility was the only one that had in our management plan that we would consider culling. So if we got parthenogenic eggs, for example, we would either kill the eggs or we were willing to euthanize young if we proved that they were parthenogenic for the betterment of the captive population. And a lot of people, a lot of managers were actually kind of like, they wished that they had that ability, because a lot of it is, well, we could use that space for other animals where that space would be more valuable instead of raising an animal that will not go to another facility, will not contribute to the genetic diversity, um, and is basically just taking up money and space because some people didn't want to care for it. And we were actually at an earlier time we were advised to euthanize um, incestuous babies for Komodo dragons, irregardless of the value of a Komodo dragon. Komodo dragons themselves are valuable, but because they were the direct offspring of a brother and sister, the SSP had told us to euthanize. So I think there is a lot less stigma in herps because of just how they reproduce. Mammals, it is a lot more stigmatized, but it's also stigmatized even just in like veterinary care. Um, Not necessarily the zoo world, but in the vet world, where vets are highly against what they find to be useless euthanasia for a healthy animal. Um, though I will say small mammals, sometimes it's a little bit different, where they're like, they're going to breed all so much. What's the use of keeping basically unwanted animals? But it is a viable option in a lot of management plans.
Right. Ryan.
Yeah, I guess just responding to that, and everyone else's. I think I started this question kind of very tunnel visioned because it's something relevant, but it's nice to have a little bit more of an understanding, like with the invertebrates and all the management uh, methods you guys just discussed. For our zoo, I guess like for our bats in general, like we have a free flight population of bats, and they are Egyptian fruit bats. We have a couple in there. Um, and they're like 95% of the SSP population. So we have like most of these bats. But they're in a large buildings and they're free breeding. So over the years, we started with like 30, and now there's well over, I'd say we're at like 1,700 right now. And they get fed, they're the most expensive animal in the zoo to feed. So they get fed just fruit, basically, over 600 pounds a day. And I'm really buff because I have to feed them. And they get a lot of food. It's ridiculous. But the problem with that is it's becoming our population is getting really big, huge. It's hard for us to manage as a keeper and just as like the team in the jungle. Horticulture as well, like we're a jungle exhibit, so plants are a really big part of that. But having all these bats and they're pooping everywhere, you might think that's great for the soil. It's not. There are nitrates and other levels of crazy nonsense that we're surprised our plants are even growing. So now the question is, what do you do about it? Like, I don't, no one here has been to the jungle, I think, but like it'd be quite the show for us to catch all of these bats. Um, and the zoo basically came to us and was like, "Do you guys like we can cull?" And we were like, "No, we're not culling 1,700 animals. That's crazy." So our next option is we're going to try to build some sort of facility. We reached out to other zoos. No other zoos really want these animals. They're bats, and if they do want them, they wanted like 10 or 20. Well, I have almost 2,000 for you. Um, we're hoping to build a building where we can move a portion of these bats. And also, birth control is not really an option because they're free flight and we have other endangered species, primates, birds. Like, there's no glass or netting separating exhibits around in our building. So, where the bats poop, they poop wherever they want. So that's a public concern for the hormone control. Also surgical, it's hard to, neuter this many bats. So we're kind of at a spot where it's like we don't know what to do. We can try some things, but all we really know, especially from the keeper team, is we basically told our president of animal management absolutely not to culling them. But it kind of does seem like the only great option, like realistic option. Culling all of them is not what the plan was, but it would be a big portion. So we're struggling with this topic and trying to figure out what else we could do for it. And because there's so many ethical issues about it, we haven't really gotten far, but
What species of bat was it?
Egyptian fruit bats. And then we
Egyptian
also
express.
have,
Okay.
yeah, there's a lot of them. And they breed, we usually get kind of 2 times a year when we start seeing pups, but they really only breed once a year. And then we also have two flying foxes, but they're two boys and they just hang out.
Yeah. Well, that's very
The West
interesting.
Liberty Bat Lab. Is that what's gonna happen?
I literally was like, how
You
many
can have
bats
them.
could we take? I was
Please take
I literally
them.
wrote, we can't take that. We can't afford to feed 600 pounds of fruit every day. There's no way. We could probably take a small number of bats.
Even
But
5 of them, something. Really, we reached out to, from what I talked to my curator, zoos, other zoos don't want them. There was a zoo in Mexico that said they wanted 100 of them, and then they ghosted us. So if anyone wants a bat, let me know.
I, I'll talk to my boss, but it definitely won't be hundreds of bats. I 100% guarantee you it will not be hundreds of bats, but we might be able to take a few of them. We have a bat person actually here on campus. Well, some of you have probably had class with Dr. Barber. Um, so her background, her one of her big interests is bats. So it could be a route to unload 15 bats. I don't know. Um, so we got a lot of people that have things to say about this. So just in order here, Jasmine, Kyle.
Um, so I feel pretty neutral about culling in general, considering I come from like cull invasive species. Kind of a hot topic. I don't really believe in TNR for cats. I believe in culling ferals. But one thing that is kind of leaving me baffled is so these bats are an SSP, correct? That's what was said.
Yeah, all of them, they are SSP, but I don't think they do anything. There's never been any action towards that.
That's really odd. And it boils down to other zoos just don't want these animals. That's all it boils down to.
Just I think we've reached out to quite a few facilities. The ones that did want the bats, I believe, were a research. It was a zoo, but it was like for a research program. And then they did talk about like giving the bats to more research programs, but then that brings up more ethical stuff like their welfare from culling versus being experimented on and stuff. So it's yeah.
I don't know. This is one of the first like ethical dilemmas in the class that I haven't really understood where I fall upon this. And maybe it's because I have a soft spot for bats. Like if I thought I could give these bats a good life, I would say give me 500. Like I will take care of them. And if we were to happen to somehow miraculously get our hands on some of those bats, I know where I would be every day. But it's just, I don't know, it feels different from culling of endangered species, not endangered, oh my Lord, culling of invasive species, because it just seems like healthy animals are being culled just because nobody wants them. That to me feels very, very odd. I
That and
don't,
also I feel like it's the institution as well, like management throughout the years. And I'm sure this is what happened. Like this happens with rodents a lot, I believe, because they breed so quickly, and it's like, well, now you have all these animals, nobody wants them. It's either cull them or figure something else out. So I feel like I personally am like pointing fingers to the 30
yeah.
years that these bats have been here, but now it's our
It
problem.
yeah, it feels like total oversight on somebody else's part, and now nobody wants them, and now they have to die. I like that with the herpetological side, they were talking about the eggs, because to me, they're not, if they're not hatched yet, then it's kind of whatever. And that's how I would feel about mammalian as well. Like how I was talking about cats, when you abort spay a cat to get rid of the kittens, like I'm neutral on that. But I don't know, this just feels kind of wrong to me that nobody wants them. Like that feels kind of wrong.
Bjorn?
Yeah, that's a really shitty situation, Ryan. I'm really sorry that you're in that position. I think for me also being, in a snake lab, we did also have to call. But something that made it a lot easier for me mentally was knowing that those animals were going to be repurposed, because there are a lot of snakes that eat other snakes. And so if we had, a clutch of excess snakes, and oftentimes those would be like non-venomous snakes that we use for like programs or stuff like that. Um, Oftentimes we would, use them to feed other snakes after we had euthanized them. Like I had a crate that would not eat, and that was actually the way that I was able to get that little baby to actually eat. And so everything that we pretty much call in that sense kind of got repurposed, and that made it a lot easier for me mentally. But yeah, I don't
I
I don't
will
know about
note
that bat situation.
our bats that are cold, because they've culled a smaller species of bat, they're fed out in to other animals within the zoo. So they're not just like going into a bin, like they are being frozen and fed out to other animals. So I guess there's
Would
a little bit of purpose, but
So all those bats that you would be potentially culling, they would all be fed out as well?
I don't know about all of them because there's so many, so I don't know the like how long they last or whatever, but most of them from what we were told like would be purposed for feeding out other animals.
All right. Caitlin, then Abby, then I'm going to wrap up this question so we can go into another one. Go ahead, Caitlin.
I guess one of my questions would be, are you guys still hand rearing the bats that like inevitably get abandoned every season? Because when I was at the jungle as an intern, occasionally like bats would like get separated from their mom, fall off their mom, whatever, and staff would hand raise them. So I would definitely like, unfortunately, darkly say like start euthanizing those ones instead of hand raising them. And then my other thought would be if you're gonna have to eventually move the bats to an off-site addition, you're gonna have to have those bats in hand anyway. So I would seriously consider castrating every single male that you encounter because I feel like castrating the males will be a less invasive surgery than it would be on the females because bat testicles are like decently sized compared to the
There's
rest of their body. And like you're gonna have to get those bats in hand to move them. So it feels like you might as well castrate then. And I would also consider like reaching out. There aren't a ton of zoos in Nebraska, but like even reaching out to Lincoln and seeing if Dr. Sarah would come back and like do a mass castration day. Cause like
They
we have
did.
done,
It didn't work out. They tried to neuter, I believe, like 10 of our male bats and then 10 of another species. They also tried a couple spays as well, and they weren't successful. The amount of time it took them to do them, how many males we have, and they also tried injecting the testes with a medication to sterilize them. Fun fact, bats are like crazy good reproducers. The females can actually hold sperm for like a year, so you can castrate and do whatever, but then the females might still get pregnant. We discussed catching up all the bats, which will be something, but catching them up and separating the sexes. But even that, we'd still need somewhere to put all the other bats. This is a conundrum, guys, and I love these bats.
All right. Abby.
I'm also pretty neutral on the topic of calling, as our well, the last zoo I worked at, we would call some of our livestock. But this question immediately made me think of Marius, I think his name is, the giraffe that was
The
at the
giraffe.
Copenhagen Zoo.
I was going to bring it up. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Even though he was healthy, he was genetically unsuitable for future captive breeding, and it said his genes were overrepresented in the captive population. Even despite several offers to adopt him out and online petitions to save him, he was still euthanized. And then I read that his body was publicly dissected, and they fed his pieces to the zoo's lions, polar bears, and tigers.
Yes, they did.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
just thought it was interesting.
It is interesting, and it's funny. I actually I looked up his name. I couldn't remember what his name was. I was like, oh, what was that draft's name? Because I was going to bring that up as an interesting point. They didn't just call Marius, they fed him in public to the lions as a part of the spectacle of the zoo. Uh, so because of time, we're not going to spend a bunch of time talking about this. But I would just say, think about how you feel about that. Personally, I think it's a hell of an enrichment opportunity for those lions. And it depicts, we talked early in the semester about how zoos kind of obfuscate some of the natural ways of animals. It doesn't get much more natural than that. I mean, unless you let the lions take down Marius themselves. So I think that's ultimately a good thing. Is maybe don't have the children watching. I don't, but in general, I think it's okay. Tiffany, I'm gonna let you go, but we have to be quick on this one.
I just wanted to say quick that it was, if they looked at the European audience, they actually weren't that upset about it. It was the North American audience that
Okay,
threw a
yeah.
fit, but usually their actual audience, they were like, nah, it was worth it. It was a learning experience. We found value out of it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's the difference in uh the cultural difference. Yeah. Yeah, you couldn't pull that off in I think any zoo in the United States without having like people with pitchforks trying to bring your zoo down. Um so anyways, it's a valuable thing to think about. There is, and no one really took this position. Some of you took a neutral position, but no one took this position. So there is the flip side position to take. Uh, And, I like to try to get all perspectives. So there are plenty of people who would say, hey, zoos, it's your fault that you can't manage these animals in a manner that controls their reproduction so you don't end up with more individuals than you could handle. So the culling of those healthy animals then is unethical, and that is on you, and it looks really bad, right? Because if you properly managed your population, it shouldn't be a problem. And like, so for example, a lot of aviaries will have problems with what they call oopsie babies because you can't find every nest, right? And so these individuals go and they made a nest in a bush somewhere in your aviary and you didn't find it, and then all of a sudden there's a baby. A lot of times the solution is we can't take on this baby, so we're going to call it a perfectly healthy baby bird. Um, and that's a place where people would criticize that and say, hey, that's on you to be more proactive in searching for those things and stopping them before they happen. One other point I would make on this topic that is an interesting thing to think about, but I do not want to spend an hour talking about culling, is, someone said culling eggs is different from culling a hatched egg. Is it? And we're not having the abortion discussion in this class, but it's kind of like at what point in the development, if you think about a snake egg, right? I have personally peeled a snake egg open. I hatched a bunch of black rat snakes at one point because a snake was having one of the couple babies I had were having trouble getting out of their eggs, and I've peeled it open, and those snakes have been, fully developed in the egg. The only difference between that baby as a snake moving around and it was just the shell, right? Like that was it. Like it was in there, it was fully developed. Um, so is it really any different? Yeah. Jasmine.
I think that was me that said that.
Uh-huh.
But I said it with the assumption that the zoo doing it was being proactive, and it wasn't like, oh, well, this egg is all the way along. It was more like, oh, here we are, we're on top of our management, like you said. Like
Yeah.
we know what we're doing, we're on top of our management.
Like
That I think was kind of the consideration with that statement, is that the zoo was being proactive about the management of their populations.
gotcha. Yeah. And just to be clear, there's not really a right or wrong answer to this. This is why it is the similar topic of abortion is a very contentious topic in our current politics because whether or not there's a right or wrong answer isn't very clear. Um, but it's just something to think about when you're thinking about culling, right? Because it's a pretty similar discussion point. And now I want to move to another question. Another question that I think could generate potentially a lot of discussion is question 12. Question 12 is, what does sentience mean? What does it have to do with decisions about animal welfare? The author suggests that invertebrates are not sentient. Is there any evidence to the contrary? Jasmine Anderson.
For this, I put that sentience is defined as the ability to undergo subjective experiences of pain and pleasure, to be in other positive or adverse experiential states. I also said that there has been evidence to the contrary that invertebrates can be sentient. I found an article by Browning and Birch, that noted that invertebrates like octopus possess neurological substrates that are complex enough to support conscious experiences or sentience.
Yeah, very good. Annabeth, you want to build on that?
I want to build on it a little bit. Me and Cleo talked about this whenever we were reading through this chapter, but the author doesn't mention any sort of outside sources about invertebrates actually having the capacity for sentience. And I feel like that's a kind of one-sided viewpoint on the author's part whenever they
Mhm.
could have showed, if there was any research at the time, another, like the other side of the argument. So I feel
Yeah.
like that's kind of one-sided
Hmm.
and doesn't really help.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. Taylor.
In terms of like what does it have to do with the decision about animal welfare? I just feel like if a person or like an organization feels that an animal is more sentient than another, then that animal that they feel is more sentient is going to receive better care than the animal that they don't view as sentient. So how we define sentience and the amount of research that we put in to like determining whether these animals are sentient or not have like it just weighs a lot on how they're treated in captivity. So I think it's very important for like I also read the article by Browning and Birch and like just like information about whether or not maybe invertebrates or things like that can feel pain or can they feel pleasure or are they sentient in general. It's very important because if we are misunderstanding their ability to feel these things and they're being treated that way, I don't think that's right. Even if I think you can argue that different species have different maybe levels of sentience, maybe, but I don't feel that should determine like their level of care.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. Cleo.
For the evidence to the contrary, I don't know exactly what drug the crayfish were put on, but Kayla read the study about crayfish being given, it was either crack or cocaine.
I think it was cocaine.
Yeah, and like the crayfish that were given the cocaine were like pacing and having abnormal behaviors, so they were having a reaction to the drug.
Okay.
I just thought it was an interesting study, and yeah.
It isn't.
That's
It isn't.
enrichment.
That isn't. We give all of our animals cocaine once a month. Um, yeah, that's a heck of an enrichment. So, um, I want to. I think it's important to clarify a point here. Uh, most people that argue that say, let's just say, let's use a beetle as an example, that a beetle is not a sentient creature, that they do not have the experience of say pain or an understanding of themselves as an entity, for example. They would say that the application of the drug and the response to that is a purely physical process that doesn't involve sentience. Um, Sort of like maybe plugging your computer into a power source that was way too powerful and it, you know, screws it up. It acts strange. It's a purely physical thing. So just driven by the chemistry of the organism, right? That is the entire argument for how those organisms live in a non-sentient state is that they're essentially organic machines that they have systems like eyes and tactile sensors on their body, things like that. They can sense the world. They have rudimentary nervous systems that can process information, and then those systems generate an output. And that's as far as those nervous systems ever get to. So yeah, if you were to infuse a beetle with cocaine, and as long as it had the right receptors that cocaine could act upon chemically, it would certainly generate a response. But they would say it's purely physical and it has nothing to do with the experience of doing cocaine. Like it's not like I feel great right now, like it's not doing that to the beetle. That would be their argument for why that doesn't actually represent sentience, just a chemical process. Um, and that doesn't necessarily mean I agree with that, but I just want to clarify that. Did they really do that? That's a heck of an experiment. Like it's actually hard for me to believe. So have you guys seen? I'll get you in a minute, Tiffany. I have to share this. There is a funny video. It's absolutely hysterical, where
Was it the
they're
spider one?
okay, thank you, Annabeth.
I was
I
just
should have
sending the
the
spider.
spider, and they're like, and then we gave the spider crack or whatever, and like it goes through like this whole list of drugs and how the spider. If you haven't seen it, look up the spider on drugs. It's so funny.
Not a real
Tiffany, go ahead.
experiment.
No, it's absolutely not real, but that's what it reminded me of. I was like, are you sure they really did that? Um, Tiffany.
So, one thing that I and my current curator, who used to be my ZM at the other facility too, that we have grappled with, especially in the ambassador animal space, there are facilities, like a big thing in ambassador welfare right now is the ability to choose. And there are some organisms where we literally don't know if they are capable of choice,
Mhm.
such as Madagascar hissing cockroaches, which are one of the most popular invert ambassador animals
Yeah.
because you can't get rid of them, basically. Um, there are facilities that are giving them the choice to participate in ambassador animal programming, and they are creating enrichment plans for Madagascar hissing cockroaches and are reaching out to other facilities to ask what they do. And I will fully admit that I outright laughed and thought it was ridiculous because it's a cockroach and we have nothing to suggest that they have the capacity to make that distinction between if I get on your hand, that means I want to go, because we haven't proven that they know what happens after they get on the hand. They're choosing to get on the hand. How do we know that they know what the hand means? Which has also been posited for like snakes. Snakes know that they can choose to get into the box, but how do we know they make the connection between the transport box and then participating in an ambassador program? Things like that. So I think there's also, yes, level of sentience shouldn't affect their care. They should get the best care you are capable of giving them, regardless of how sentient they are, because they're a living being. They deserve proper care.
Mhm.
But there's also a level where we're like, you're giving a cockroach the option to choose what it's doing. It's a they like, do they even choose what food they want to eat? Do they make any choices in their life? So there's a lot of weird areas that people are just like, well, if this kinkajou gets the chance to choose, then we have to give it to a tarantula, to a cockroach. And I've laughed at it. I understand in some cases, but sometimes it just seems ridiculous.
Mhm. Um, so the challenge lies in our shifting perspectives and understanding, because there was a time when people might have said, so they might have said something like, there's no way an octopus has any sentience, right? They did say that for a long, long time. Even when I was a kid, that was the predominant perspective. And now we've come to have a very different perspective on that thing because we've learned more and more and more about them. And so we may find in the future, if we are willing to put the effort in with these other invertebrates, we may find that we were wrong. Um, it is an incredibly difficult thing to really get at the heart of understanding whether these animals have sentience. They are very distantly related to us. Their nervous systems, while they have similarities, are quite different. They're decentralized in many aspects. Um, and you were talking about like, well, does the cockroach, if it gets in my hand, know it's going to go be an ambassador today? And it probably doesn't intuitively. It feels like the answer to that question should be no. But we have no way of um, very easily examining whether or not something like a cockroach understands cause and effect, right? Like we cannot ask them, and that is where our understanding breaks down. It becomes so difficult. Caitlin.
I was gonna say about the ambassador animal thing and like the whole idea of choice. Like, yes, we don't know whether the cockroach knows that by going into your hand it's going to be presented, or that even the snake does. But I like the idea that giving them different options to do those things might improve overall welfare, like versus shoving a snake in a crate or some sort of carrier, or giving it like a branch that it can reach out to and choose to like coil around, which might be a more comfortable setting for it anyway. That snake might not understand that it's about to go on a program, but like it might have transitioned from one space to another in a way that's more comfortable for it. And I feel like that improves
Mm.
overall husbandry and welfare of that animal, even if it doesn't actually relate to sentience, if I'm explaining all of that in a way
Yeah,
that makes sense.
yeah, I think you're saying that I could just grab the animal and take it, right? Like I could just grab it out of the box or whatever and take it. But that's not going to be as comfortable of a, as you said, transition between one space and another as it will be if I voluntarily climb into your hand or whatever. And yeah, I would agree with that. That yeah, if you grab the hissing cockroach, clearly that's going to be much more stressful to that animal than to let it crawl into your hand. So, Taylor.
I just have a quick question. So you were kind of like talking about how the cockroach doesn't know that they're necessarily going to participate in an ambassador program, but do we have like any evidence or like research to show that like other animals that are like popularly in ambassador programs do know that they're going into it? Like I'm not sure. I'm just curious. Like how do we know that animals that we consider more sentient know that they're necessarily like participating in an ambassador program or not?
Tiffany, go ahead.
I think there's actually been some studies cortisol is a lot of what they use for welfare when it comes to really any animal, but especially mammals because it's non-invasive. Um, I think they have found, if I remember, found evidence that especially larger mammals that are used, they have different cortisol levels and they have physical reactions if they realize, like if they're in a routine of what actually happens when they get used for an ambassador program. That suggests they know what's happening and they have an increased stress level. It depends on what you consider an unhealthy amount of stress. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's they're so stressed that it's causing discomfort or anything like that. But they've basically suggested that this animal knows what's happening and they are preparing themselves for it and they know the cause of this action.
Yeah. Uh, Jasmine Anderson, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I recently went to the ZAA conference and they actually had Dr. Samantha Russick from Tanganyika Zoo there who had done a study with their facility and 7 to 10 other facilities that had ambassador programs and were trying to record positive, neutral, or negative reactions that they have with the ambassador animals to see if this is something that they actually enjoy doing. And most of their research, I think it was about 95 to 96% of the animals doing them had positive reactions, and only I think it was 2% had negative, and then I think the other like 3 or 4% it was just neutral behaviors.
So, so did you say that it was based on behaviors and how we code those behaviors, not based on like hormone levels or anything like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, behaviors themselves are tricky because sometimes, I mean, often we've had enough experience with animals to have an idea of what behaviors mean, of course. But there are definitely sometimes I think the behaviors are tricky to interpret as well, where that behavior is normally something I associate with that animal being happy, but this situation it doesn't, you see a behavior and you're like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense in this context. You know, behaviors are sometimes difficult to interpret. Taylor.
Yeah, you saying that can remind me of like people like interpreting dogs wagging their tails being like happy, which
Hmm.
is not necessarily the case. So unless you like deeply, deeply, deeply know the behavior of the species that you're working with, I mean, like I've known people that have had dogs all their lives and still associate dog wagging with happy, or like
Yeah.
maybe like licking, like appeasement licking as like enjoying the behavior, like encouraging it. So it's like that's why I think that I like agree with you that determining whether or not they're enjoying it based on behavior can be a little tricky and kind of make me based on like the individual themselves.
Yeah, yeah, there are, when you're trying to convert a behavior into essentially the English language, right? Because they cannot speak. So you're trying to translate from physical motion, and it is oftentimes a very rough translation to our language. Um, Behavior is extremely valuable in understanding animals and understanding their welfare even, but we do have to be very cautious in the interpretation. That's my opinion. Um, okay. What I wanted to I wanted to bring up a couple other points. So we talked about cephalopods. Are there any other invertebrates that you can think of that might have some form of sentience or something close to it, Tiffany?
Bees are often thought to be fairly sentient. They have fantastic memories.
Hmm. That's what I studied in grad school. That's what I wanted to bring it up. Bjorn, what did you want to say?
I was also gonna say bees, and I was actually raising my hand to specifically ask you about that. Um, and this also goes back to what we were kind of just talking about with interpreting behaviors. Because in my research for this question, I landed on the book The Mind of a Bee, which looks to be a very, very interesting book. But I also landed on another study that that said that bumblebees exhibited play-like behavior because they enjoyed rolling around little wooden balls.
Yeah.
And I feel like, for anyone who is in the animal behavior class, defining play is very, very interesting when it comes to animals. And there are a lot of like specifications that are incorporated to actually define an action as play, including like very dumbed down. There's like no reason for them to be doing what they're doing.
Yes,
So I was actually wondering what you thought about that, and if you think that, that behavior could be considered play in the bumblebees.
I do. I actually do. Um, and bees in general are wicked smart. It's not smart the, like you or I. They're not sitting down and talking philosophically about anything, right? Their spatial intelligence is phenomenal. They, at least highly social bees, particularly like apis bees, um, are able to communicate with each other in their own particular way, which is very different from the way we communicate. Um, and within the evolutionary framework of insects, they are essentially it would be the most evolutionarily derived group of insects. Uh, their, how do I say that? Their nervous systems are much more advanced than most of the other insects. That is not to say that other insects don't also, reach close to the same level. I'm not trying to insinuate that. Um, just that it could be that they've hit the level of neurological complexity to start to exhibit some of these behaviors that other insects haven't. That's a possibility. Um, but yes, I do think that, to me, what play really is, and this is just to me, I'm not a professional behaviorist. I should say that, right out front. But play is just exactly what you said. It is an activity that has no apparent purpose in the existence of an organism that it still chooses to engage in. It might not be play, it might be a form of self-entertainment, or maybe even you might consider it a form of investigation, right? But it shows a little higher level thinking in any respect. It might not necessarily be play. It might not be like, I'm rolling the ball. This is so fun. That might not be exactly what's going on through its mind, but it might be like, what's this thing? But it shows an engagement with an environment that goes beyond just a robotic sort of engagement. Um, that's my opinion. There are probably people who would strongly disagree with me, and that's okay. So yes, I do. I think bees are amazing. Like I said, they're very intelligent. And studying bees was really beneficial for me in getting perspective on things like this, because I, I feel like we do not give lower inverts the respect that they deserve as animals. Um, and that's a problem. But I don't, we are, we're really running low on time, and we still have a bunch of stuff to talk about. So I don't want to go in deep on that, but I think this was some really good discussion. Uh, Now, do bumblebees require little balls to play with to have good, wholesome lives? I'm not really suggesting that. But I think bumblebees can be perfectly happy without that in their lives. Nonetheless, I do think it's a form of play. So we're gonna we only have 40-ish minutes left. We are officially, I'm going to say, in the last hour. I know not everyone necessarily answered everything in the second hour. Everyone has to answer a question in the next 45 minutes. Um, so we have the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum survey. Let's talk about the survey. So question 21, what were the findings of the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum survey? How are these findings relevant to design and conservation decisions in other zoos? Jasmine Anderson.
I put a good portion of the people that had visited the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum did not see it as a zoo and thought of it more as a museum, then asked what they liked about the Desert Museum. About 26 people said that they enjoyed seeing the animals and seeing the plants, while most people, about 32 individuals, said that they enjoyed seeing the natural environments and habitats. I think that this is relevant to design and conservation decisions that others should use, because it shows that most people enjoy the immersive exhibits and the landscaping on them as much as much, if not more, than just seeing an animal in an exhibit.
Yeah. So you want to build up on that? I think there's lots of things to take out of this survey. Tiffany?
There was one thing they specifically said that really kind of hit me, and that was the quote. It is interesting that some of the most scripted and managed experiences, such as animal demonstrations or feedings, those requiring the most training and bending of animal behavior to human will, are the experiences many visitors identified as feeling most wild. Um, which I, as an educator, have directly dealt with that there's definitely again this idea of what we considered wild, and they found um, seeing an animal in the most managed sense as their most wild interaction with an animal was very interesting.
That is interesting. Um, why do you guys think that is? Is it because the people in these situations don't have any more wild fr experiences to draw off of? Does anybody have any thoughts about that? Right.
I almost feel like the general public's idea of wild, which is something, I mean, we've discussed
Hmm.
a lot. I don't think maybe they have the same idea as wild as what the people who are like, surveying have. Like, if I were to say I have no zoo experience and I go to a zoo and I get to feed an otter, or a lemur experience is a popular one, like that's gonna be really cool, and that's gonna feel really wild to me with like the general sense. So I kind of feel like the people who are like, oh, those experiences felt the most wild, maybe they don't have a full understanding of what wild might be. Maybe to them, they're just thinking exotic. And like, this was a really exotic experience. This was a really fun experience. Not necessarily that the experience was more wild.
Wild.
Something I thought about.
Yeah, that's a good point. So are we mixing terms? Essentially, what we think of as just exotic is not the same thing as wild in all reality, but perhaps that's exactly what's happening. It's a great point. Caitlin.
So giving the public the benefit of the doubt, which I rarely do, I would say that it's possible that maybe some of those very controlled programs exhibit wild behaviors. So like when you see a cheetah run, that's a controlled experience, but that cheetah's exhibiting a wild behavior that you would probably never get to see in the wild, or some of those more like charismatic dolphin or seal shows where they do like really acrobatic jumps or swimming. Like that's something that you would never likely see, but it does serve a purpose, and some of it is a wild behavior. So maybe that's what they mean, that like they're getting to see these wild behaviors, even though it's in a very controlled way.
Hmm. That's a good point. That can that's a form of wildness to see natural behaviors. Um, Jasmine.
For me, it kind of brings to mind like the pet food commercials where they'll have like wolves running and then be like, feed your dog's wild side. And it's like your dog isn't wild. It's domesticated. It's been domesticated for hundreds and thousands of years or whatever. I don't remember the exact timeline.
Thousands, yeah.
So for me, I mean, it feels like kind of a given to say it out loud actually, but it's definitely more about their interpretation of their experience and not about the animal itself. They felt wild. They felt shy. Sorry, my cat's talking too. I wasn't sure if you guys could hear it.
That's okay.
They felt wild and they felt free. They felt excited, but they didn't really think about the animal itself being wild. Uh, get off the desk, bub. Okay. Um, but all right, my cat just ruined my train of
You're
thought.
you're fine. I understood your points.
Okay, sweet.
All right, Taylor.
Yeah, kind of go along with what everyone is saying. When they were doing survey, and they were assessing like the zoo-ness of their facility. People focused more on their personal experiences and expectations rather than the animals' experiences. So that might tie in that like maybe they're like seeing wild from maybe like more so their perspective than the animals. Like, oh, I'm seeing something that like I typically wouldn't see. So like because it's like from their point of view, maybe it's
Mm,
wild, but not necessarily like the animal's point of view.
mhm. Yeah, I get what you're saying. Um, yeah. So I think it's grounded in experience. So just as an example, when I was a child, if you took me to the zoo, I think if I had to go back and to my, I don't know, 7-year-old brain for a moment, that I would have thought it was a pretty wild experience because I did not have experience beyond that so much. Maybe not, because I played on the woods a lot when I was a kid, so that might not have been the case. But certainly now, when I go to the zoo, I don't see it as wild at all. And when I see the like have an interaction with an animal things that zoos use to raise money, like you know, I don't see those as like wild, experiences. I see them as highly curated experiences. That doesn't mean I don't want to do them. I still think they're cool. I was so excited at the Columbus Zoo to go feed the giraffes. I was like, absolutely, I want to do that. Why would I not want to do that? But at no point was I like, this is just like being there with the giraffes out in nature. That did not cross my mind at any point. It's clearly not wild, but it's a cool experience. Yeah, Bjorn.
So something that I think is pretty interesting, actually, hearing you guys talk about this, was that something that I wrote in my answer, and I kind of want to go back and reread this portion of the book now that I'm hearing everybody else talk. But there was a portion where they, I think, also asked people what they thought would make the museum itself feel more wild. Um, and part of that was like an increase in enclosure size, less groomed grounds, and a reduction of animals that the museum actually interprets. So it's basically just like a slow transition to the just natural landscape. And so I just thought that was a little bit interesting because it seems like, those experiences with the animals, people interpret that as wild, but at the same time, when they're walking through the facility, it seems like it feels more wild and less like a traditional zoo if they're not seeing many animals at all. And so I think that contradiction is actually kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, that is. Um, at some point, you would just have a sign that said, you know, the zoo, and it would just be in the middle of a field, and you'd be like, just walk around this field, it's the zoo. So wild, completely wild experience. Ryan.
So for this question and on the topic of wildness, I know we talked in the past, like I kind of had this idea that the term wild like can be a bit on of like a gradient on a scale, like some animals. I think my example was, a monkey in a zoo versus a monkey in the wild, like they're kind of on a different scale of wild. Do you think that zoos can be on a different scale of wild? Like do you think zoos today are more wild than zoos were 10, 20, 30 years ago? And can
Uh,
that idea of wildness be translated into like an institution?
yeah, so I think that in general the answer to your question is yes. And the Arizona Sonora and Desert Museum is I think a really fair example of a zoo that has come closer to it's far more wild than just animals in cages. A very cool part of that museum is literally walking around and there are all sorts of lizards running all over the walkways as you're walking and everything. Um, and actually, I have a lot of fun when I'm there. I just take pictures of lizards, and like try to get them. They had this like like display that they do that's kind of like a hey back off display where they do push-ups. So they'll come out on the trail, and if if you don't spook them, um, you can kind of like sometimes get them to come out and do push-ups at you, and and that's a wild experience, right? That really is. So yeah, some zoos have done a better job of that than others. Um, I don't think I feel like highly natural looking enclosures are the same thing as feel. They don't still don't feel wild to me. Um, but I appreciate tremendously that they do a good job of depicting what a natural situation appears to be. And that's just my interpretation of wildness. To me, if an experience is wild when you remove the gate, right? When all possible outcomes are on the table, which means that if I'm looking at a tiger, that tiger is a wild experience when the tiger can eat me. And if not, it's a curated experience, no matter how natural it appears, right? I don't want to be eaten by a tiger, right? So I'm glad that we have the curated version, but it doesn't feel wild. I can't feel fear in that situation. And that means that certain sensations are off the table that would exist in a truly wild circumstance. Annabeth.
See, now that you had your talk, I feel differently on the way what I was going to say. I was going to say I think sometimes it's the opposite,
Mhm.
where zoos have gotten less wild as we've progressed in time. And I think my train of thought there was like technology advancements has led us
Good point.
away from wildness. But what you said about the desert museum has made me think that maybe with the technology and what we've known, that has allowed us to simulate or integrate. That's probably integrate's probably a better word. Wildness into our zoos. So I just I wanted to mention that because I think in some cases it might have gone backwards just a little bit, and but in most cases, I think that yes, you're right. Over time, that we've kind of reclaimed wildness a little bit more into our zoos.
Yeah, I really like that you brought up technology, and you're completely correct, I think, in that interpretation. And maybe you guys can argue with me about it if you don't agree, but there is absolutely nothing wild about walking through the zoo and seeing the uh 3D get in this big bubble and see what it's like to be a pterodactyl experience or what you know what I mean? Like they have these like things that I'm like, it is completely not wild. There's not a single damn thing that's wild about that. Uh and so those sort of things take us in the very opposite direction from wildness. I 100% agree. Um, I think a place other than the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum, my very favorite zoo is the National Aviary. Um, it's not really that big of a facility, but it's probably as close as you can get to wild. It's still a very curated experience, but um, because you just walk into these spaces that represent different habitats, right? They have a grassland um, they have a wetland and they have a rainforest, and you're just in this space and pretty well any of those birds could just fly up and poop on you or do whatever. And so like in that situation, for the most part, all possibilities are on the table. If the blue-bellied roller just wanted to peck my eyes out, it could come at me and try, right? Like, and so I like that. Not because I none of those birds are going to do anything like that. Uh, the great Argus did come up to me and like peck at my hand one time when I wasn't paying attention, which is kind of cool. Uh, but yeah, generally that is a much closer to a wild experience, even though it's indoors. Caitlin.
Agreeing more with that, like technology and things getting less wild. I feel like you could even apply that sometimes to exhibit design. The Detroit Zoo used to have tree kangaroos, and we had a massive honey locust tree, like a real honey locust tree that grew in their exhibit, and the exhibit didn't have a top, so they could go probably like 80 feet up into the air in this tree. And that's very natural behavior for a tree kangaroo. That's what they would be doing in the wild. But at one point in time, there was a tree kangaroo that fell from the tree and it died, which is
My
a
goodness.
natural risk.
Yeah.
I would say most tree kangaroo exhibits that I've seen that were built long after when ours were are indoor exhibits with fake trees or outdoor exhibits with really, really like short trees because nobody wants them to go up high in a tree and die because that's obviously a huge risk and it is very sad. But like that is their most natural behavior. Like being up in a real tree is more natural than a structure that has been designed to realistically look like a tree but isn't a tree.
Yeah, kangaroo skyscraper, basically. Yeah, 100%. That's a great point. Um, and even I like that you brought up the risk to the animal that comes through its natural behavior, right? That's what I kind of meant by like why when something feels wild, it's like all available possibilities are on the table. And when you start throwing safety nets down in whatever various forms they might take, you remove those possibilities. Now, at the same time, you're worried about animal welfare. You don't want your tree kangaroo to die. God forbid some 5-year-old is looking at the tree kangaroo and it plummets 80 feet from a tree and breaks its neck, right? That would be a really bad experience for that kid. It would just be a horrible thing. Um, and so we don't want that to happen. So we eliminate the possibility of that happening, but then that makes it less wild because we have taken that out of the potential pool of events that can happen. Um, I think I really, I did something to Bjorn with that statement. I don't know. He just started grabbing his. Um, great point. Let's move into this last little bit of stuff and wrap up here. I think we've hit on quite a bit of question 22 and just various other discussions this semester. Let's see here. Let's talk about 23. The author states that many zoos might find unacceptable the consequent trade-off between commercial activity and the essentially charitable role of conservation. Are conservation efforts charitable?
Did you say my name or are you muted for a reason?
And my phone started ringing, then I muted it myself. I apologize.
No, you're fine.
I did say Annabeth. Yes, yes.
I saw your
I'm
lips
telling this
moving.
person, hey, I will talk to you in 30 minutes. That's what
Yeah, I think conservation is charitable. I think so. I think it's a charity for the animal. I think it's like for the species. I think it's a charitable effort for the animals that benefit from the species, like in the ecosystem. And I think it's charitable for humans and future generations to be able to experience that animal. So I think that there's multiple sides of it, not just for human game, but also for environmental positivity. Um, but yeah, just having that animal live so other people can experience it and see it and learn, especially if it's like what we said, if it's a success story. I think that's also very positive. So yeah, I think it's charitable, 100%.
okay. Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah, this just popped in my brain as you were talking, Annabeth, but could you, I guess I would kind of think like it might not be charitable in some ways because these organizations basically have to do conservation or they don't get all the other benefits of being under certain like AZA, like you have to do conservation or else you're not AZA. So that's not really a choice. Like they're doing it because they have to. That being said, like donations that you get from like zoo events, galas, or even like the donate a penny, donate a dollar kind of stuff. I would consider those charitable, but I also think like if you get really nitty gritty with it, like these organized, some of them at least have to do conservation.
Yeah. Um, sure, you're next.
I totally agree with that. I think in my response, I also wrote it's like if people who are not really involved in wildlife or biology, if it's somebody who lives in the city and who's completely separate from anything nature related, at least in their perception, and they give money, it's like, sure, that's charity. But if you have institutions where that is their primary purpose, and in my opinion, that is what zoos are for. If that's their primary purpose, at that point, I would not necessarily call it charity, but I would call that their, their goal. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to justify them. And I would also argue that, and this goes this goes pretty deep, but in my opinion, conservation is not just for, protecting wildlife, it's also to protect people. Like conservation at this point is not an optional thing. It is necessary. It's necessary if we want to survive as humans on this planet. And so it's very odd to me to say it's like, okay, these donations or these efforts are charitable if they're really theoretically benefiting us as well.
Yeah, that's actually you almost verbatim just read my notes page. Like for my thoughts on that particular topic. So I agree with you. Taylor.
Yeah, I'm just kind of going to say that I definitely agree with what he's saying. Like, I personally don't think it's charitable. I think that they're morally obligated to do so. If like these institutions are claiming that, this is their mission, these are their goals, like I wouldn't consider like a parent taking care of their children as charitable. Yes, they're like helping someone else, but is it charitable? Or like is a server bringing people food like at a restaurant charitable, or are they just doing their job? Like if they're helping them, yeah, and maybe you can see it as like a charitable act in the sense like they're helping someone, but like that's what they're supposed to be doing. So like just like kind of like based on the premise that like this is like what they're claiming that they're all about, and like what this is what they're supposed to be doing, this is what they're morally obligated to be doing. I don't necessarily think I'd consider it like a charitable act per se. And I really like how Bjorn added that like it benefits us as well. Like it's not necessarily full-heartedly charitable in the sense that like it's selfless, like we're not benefiting from it all at all whatsoever.
Yeah, great. Cleo.
Well, I definitely took a very broad, maybe didn't go too in depth on this, but you guys' answers were freaking awesome. I just looked at it as it's charitable because you're donating to something that you really care and support about. And if you look at conservation in that light, then yes, it is charitable.
Okay. Um, so this is meant to be as many of these questions I try to make them like not like have a single obvious correct answer. Um, yeah, so one of the points that I have in my notes that I'm glad a couple of you brought up was the necessity of what we do, right? Which is what Bjorn kind of kicked off in this discussion. Um, if we do not maintain a certain stability uh, within our ecosystems, they will collapse, and other organisms will fill in niches as organisms are taken out. But ultimately, we are reliant on functional ecosystems, and if we just let it all crumble to hell, uh, that is the foundation that our civilization is built on, and it will also crumble with it. So there is an absolute necessity in it. Now, what I would say, and this is not something that you can measure at the level of zoo, but you can measure at the level of the individuals within the zoo, is that charity is a sort of it's a mindset. It is what is the underlying intent in your action? The zoo as a whole institution doesn't have an underlying intent, right? But the individuals do. And individuals whose motivation for their actions are selfish, in my argument, in my opinion, are not ever being charitable because they are doing a thing explicitly to get something back out of it. But when you do a thing because you think it's morally right and not because you're going to get your paycheck from it or you're going to get praised for doing it, you're going to get some recognition or something. When you do it because it is morally right, that is charitable, right? That would be my opinion. It's based on the intent of individuals, and you can't measure that for a zoo. You might look at the leadership of of a zoo and say like, are those people doing this from a moral, charitable perspective, or are they doing it because it brings lots of money into the zoo? Um, Obviously, we cannot look into the heart of men or women. So, and they're not going to say, very few people would say, I'll just do it for the money. Most people won't say that. So there's no way to actually know. Um, that's just my perspective. I think you all had good and fair perspectives. I like, uh, Annabeth, you have a very positive and sort of like uh, optimistic outlook on human nature, I think, and that's good. I wish I had that. Um, it would make life a lot easier sometimes. Uh, I sometimes take a edging on nihilistic perspective of existence, so it makes things difficult. Uh, I certainly don't think all people are just like morally good and want to do charitable things. But I think having those different perspectives in a discussion like this is extremely valuable. Okay, great answers. We are at 5 minutes till we're supposed to stop. Let, just what is this last question? We're just going to stop there. We're going to stop there. None of these things are things we can talk about in the next 4-ish minutes. So we'll stop there for the night, so we don't go over time. And thank you all for a really good discussion tonight. Now, next week is spring break. We will not be having a discussion next week. So we don't have a discussion on spring break. There's no class on spring break. So you'll see that in the due dates. Like the next thing is the Tuesday after that. Um, if someone wants to, they can call me and we can discuss something. By all means, I'll give you my number. But we will not have an official discussion on spring break. So we all good? How's everybody doing on the paper? No one's just like having a heart attack or anything. Taylor.
Just a quick question. So the questions for the week after spring break, like those that you posted, those are going to be due then. So like they don't have to be due next Tuesday. They'll be due like the Tuesday after that. So we have like
Yeah.
extra time to work on them.
You basically get a whole extra week to do that module.
Cool.
You just pretend like for the purposes of the class, next week just doesn't exist. We just skip it. Um, so no one has anything they need to talk about with the paper. The paper's due in 5 days, I think. Okay, Brian.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, like, I know you said it's APA formatting. Does that include like the title page and everything? You want all of that included? And I know
No.
you said single space, not double space, but
Yeah, I do not want a title page. I mean, I don't, if you do it, I don't care, but
I'll
that
delete
is
mine. Yeah.
yeah, that is completely irrelevant to me. It does not count toward your page limit. So don't think you're going to pull a fast one off of me and get a free page out of it or anything like that. Not that I think you would do that, but yeah, I don't care about that. All I care about is that the actual citations in text and in your references are done that way. Tiffany.
Uh, is it okay if I have like a non-related question, but just because I have a question for this group of people?
Sure.
Okay, I am designing a day camp for young kids, so 6 to 12, but we're splitting them up. And I want to do a camp on animal careers, and I really want to highlight wildlife biology. And I wonder if anyone knew of like a good activity I could do with younger kids that would really highlight what a wildlife biologist would do, other than like looking in a microscope or something like that. I would love to get them outside if anyone can think of
I
something
literally
for that.
I do that for a living.
I know.
I can tell you all
That's what
sorts of
I was like,
things.
these are the people I wanted to ask because I just need, even if it's like just like 20 minutes, something I can have. There's 6 to 9 and then 10 to 12, just activities that would highlight wildlife biology.
Do you have a stream nearby?
No, we are in.
Damn.
I have a pond, but I don't have a stream.
Pond should work
Okay.
as long. Now, when do you have to do it? What season? Like, is it like
This is a
tomorrow?
summer. No, this
Okay.
is like July.
Yeah. Get a dip net. Just have your zoo buy a dip net. Do a macro invertebrate sampling. I don't care if you are 5 years old or 15 years old
I
or
freaking
40
hate
years old.
macroinvertebrate sampling, but yeah, that would be good.
You're crazy.
I didn't even.
At all levels of ages, there are ways you
Yeah,
can frame the discussion that are really interesting.
that's
When it's
true.
really little kids, you're like, look at the wiggly things. How fun is
Yes.
this?
Okay.
Um, and you just build up from there. So
Okay.
that would be my suggestion. Does anybody else have
That's a good one. I didn't even think about that, and I literally did it in college and hated it. But yeah, that would be lots of fun. I don't like counting bugs.
Don't
I don't
count them.
like. That's what I was told to do. I had to count them and ID them, and it was. But yeah, no, you're right. Kids love wiggly things, so I like that idea. Thank you.
You're welcome. You can, if you want to talk about this, like through email, or I will literally
Okay.
give you my phone number and you can call me. We can talk
Okay.
about it. That's fine.
Thank
Um,
you.
does anyone else want to throw anything out? Does anyone have like a favorite activity they did when they were in school that was like, oh man, that made me want to work with animals? Yeah, Caitlin.
Not really a school thing, more like a wildlife biology type thing. I think when I was a Girl Scout, we got like little mini notebooks and we just went outside for a little while and you just had to record notes about like what you saw out in the wild
Mm.
and like what did you notice about it and like detail it like you're taking field notes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a cool thing. As long as you gotta hope you got something to observe that's interesting. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's definitely a cool thing. Does anybody else want to throw Tiffany an idea? All right. Well, that's what we
Those
got.
are great. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone have a great night.